When most people hear the word colonization, they picture red-coated soldiers, tea in Boston, or far-flung British and European empires. The United States, for example, only stepped fully into that story in the 17th century, which is very recent on the timeline of human history. But long before European powers crossed the Atlantic, another people were already building a web of colonies across an entire sea. They were not chasing flags and borders. They were chasing trade. These were the Phoenicians. Phoenicia was a thalassocratic civilization, a sea-based power that existed as early as 2500 BC along the shores of the Levant. It was not a single united kingdom. Instead, it was a chain of independent city-states like Tyre, Byblos, and Sidon, dotted along a narrow strip of coast. Each city had its own dynasty and its own sacred traditions, yet together they formed a loose front when they looked outward, toward the open water. On land, they were neighbors. At sea, they were a network. Unlike the sprawling land empires that would one day march across continents, the Phoenicians were not obsessed with territory for its own sake. They did not dream of painting the map their color. Their power came from the sea lanes. Tyre, Byblos, Sidon, and other ports owed their wealth to trade. The city that would later become their most spectacular offspring, Carthage, was also built on the same foundation. Ships, not legions, were the real engines of their influence. The Phoenicians knew the sea in a way few others did. They learned every current and wind along the Mediterranean. They could hug the familiar coastline of the Levant or push far out to new horizons. Their routes carried them to Britain, to the long Atlantic edge of Africa, and deep into the maze of Greek islands. For them, the Mediterranean was not a barrier. It was a highway. Yet even for such skilled navigators, constant long-distance voyages were risky and exhausting. Sailing from the Levant to Spain or Morocco without support points would have been like trying to cross a continent with no inns, no wells, and no safe roads. The first solution was simple. They began by setting up small way stations, just practical places along the shore where a crew could find fresh water, mend damaged hulls, and trade with local communities. These early sites were not meant to be cities. They were little more than beachheads, a sheltered cove, a crude jetty, a few storehouses, and a shrine to keep the gods on their side. But as the years passed, the merchants noticed something. These modest outposts could be much more than rest stops. If they turned a way station into a permanent settlement, that place could become a new market. A second home port, a local hub where Phoenician goods arrived in bulk, were stored, and then trickled out slowly into the countryside. Instead of one quick transaction when a ship called in, there could be a permanent flow of trade. The people of that region would start to depend on the goods, the craftsmanship, and even the credit lines the visitors offered. Control of the shoreline could slide into their hands without a single battle. That shift marks the beginning of Phoenician colonization. The problem for historians is pinning down the exact moment when this change took place. Ancient writers claimed that the Phoenicians began founding overseas settlements as early as the 12th century BC. Many modern historians, looking at archaeology and comparing it with Greek expansion, argue that true colonization started later, around the 8th century BC. Both views hold a piece of the truth. The early centuries, from the 12th to the 8th century BC, were an age of pre-colonial trade. The Phoenicians were building way stations, seasonal camps, and tiny coastal hamlets. In the 8th to 6th centuries BC, many of those dots hardened into real cities. That is when the network became a chain of colonies. One of the best places to see how well this system worked is on the long peninsula we now call Spain. Imagine a Phoenician captain leaving the Levant and steering into the Western Sea. After a long voyage, his prow cuts into new waters off the Iberian coast. There, tucked behind protective headlands, lie the harbors that will tie his homeland to a world of metal and grain. One of the earliest of these was Gadir, later known as Cadiz. It sat near rich deposits of silver and other metals and became both a mining port and a warehouse for goods coming and going. Further along the same stretch of shoreline rose colonies like Adra and Almuñécar, Cartagena, Ibiza, and Malaga. Each one was another knot in the cord that linked the Atlantic edge of Europe back to Tyre and Sidon. At first they were small enclaves. In time, many became full towns with temples, workshops, and crowded quays. Sail east from those Spanish harbors, and you meet the rugged outline of Sicily. The Phoenicians tried to plant themselves first on Ortygia, a strategic island anchoring one end of the eastern coast. They were not alone. Greek settlers had also set their eyes on the same key point. The Greeks proved stubborn, and the rivalry was intense. The Phoenicians shifted their efforts and instead took hold of places like Motya, Palermo, and Solunto. These sites, spread around the edges of Sicily, served as vital stepping stones. They allowed ships to cross the central Mediterranean in manageable jumps. Greece might dominate some of the eastern harbors, but the Phoenicians quietly wrapped their own chain of ports around the island's rim. Farther north and west, Sardinia offered another set of anchors. Its coasts were rugged, but the bays of Cagliari and Nora gave safe shelter. Pharos and Sulci formed more links in the line. A Phoenician ship moving between Spain and the central Mediterranean could hop from one of these harbors to the next, always staying within reach of friendly land. In each of these places, the basic pattern repeated. A small outpost grew into a bustling settlement. Warehouses appeared. Local markets began to rely on imported goods. The language of the newcomers seeped into everyday trade. Even when the people inland stayed entirely themselves, their coast became part of an invisible Phoenician system. If we turn back toward the east for a moment, we find Cyprus. This island had long been known for its copper. To the Phoenicians, it was both neighbor and prize. They did not have to cross the whole Mediterranean to get there, but the island still stood far enough offshore to be a serious undertaking. Early on, cities like Larnaca began to show a Phoenician presence. Here, colonization took a slightly different shape. The distance from the Levant was short enough that ties remained very close. Copper from Cyprus moved steadily into Phoenician hands. In return came timber, finished goods, and access to the wider sea network that stretched westward. Cyprus was a hinge, connecting older Bronze Age trade routes with the rising Phoenician thalassocracy. The western and southern edges of the Mediterranean told the same story in a slightly different accent. Along the coast of what is now Algeria, the Phoenicians planted colonies in places that would later become Annaba and Algiers. Each harbor began as a practical choice: a safe bay, a defensible headland, a nearby source of fresh water. Over time, these locations turned into permanent footholds that allowed Phoenician merchants to tap into the wealth of the inland tribes. To the far west, on the Atlantic gateway of Morocco, cities like Larache, Tangier, Asila, Rabat, and Azila also came under Phoenician influence. Together, these ports turned the southern shore of the Mediterranean into a long line of friendly fires guiding their ships. North Africa did not just provide a line of supply, it provided a stage for something new. In the lands that would one day be called Tunisia, the Phoenicians filled the coast with their own cities. Utica was one of the earliest. Hadrumetum, later known as Susa, and Thapsus joined it. Chela became another node in this growing web. These were not just lonely warehouses on a foreign shore. They were true urban centers, with their own elites, their own shrines, and their own crowded harbors. A little farther east, along the coast of Libya, Tripoli, Sabratha, and Leptis also took root as Phoenician colonies. When a sailor from Tyre walked down those streets, he would hear familiar words, smell familiar incense in the temples, and see the same styles of jewelry and carved ivory that lined the markets back home. From this dense cluster of North African colonies, one city would soon rise above all others, turning a commercial chain into something that looked very much like an empire of its own, and reshaping the balance of power in the entire Western Mediterranean. To see how this web of trading colonies could harden into fortresses and pull the Phoenicians into open conflict with rival powers, we first need to follow the rise of Carthage inside their own network. On the coast of what is now Tunisia, the Phoenicians founded a new city. In their own language, they called it Carthage. The Greeks and later the Romans would call it Carthage. At first, it was only one more link in the chain, a younger sister to older cities like Utica, but its position was almost perfect. It sat in the middle of the southern Mediterranean, on a bay with good shelter and fertile land behind it. From Carthage, a ship could reach Sicily, Sardinia, or Spain in a series of short jumps. The city was like a hand stretched across the sea, fingers touching every shore. Carthage grew faster than expected. Merchants from Tyre and Sidon poured into the new port. Local tribes came to trade livestock, grain, and raw materials. Workshops sprang up near the quays. Potters, metalworkers, and weavers turned imported resources into finished goods. The same purple dye that had made Tyre famous now stained cloth here as well. Over time, Carthage developed its own elite families, its own ruling council, and its own ambitions. It was still Phoenician in language, religion, and style. Yet it was no longer just a distant branch. It was becoming the trunk of a new tree. Many of the colonies we think of as Phoenician were, in fact, tied more closely to Carthage than to the older Levantine cities. As Tyre and Sidon watched the great empires of the East rise and fall around them, Carthage looked west. It drew the smaller settlements of North Africa into its orbit. It did the same in Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and along the coast of Spain. A merchant in Gadir might still speak of Phoenicia as a homeland, but the officials who collected his taxes and the admirals who protected his harbor were often Carthaginian. Even so, the basic idea behind each colony remained the same. A Phoenician, or later a Carthaginian, settlement was almost always born as a commercial project. A group of families would leave a mother city. They would sail to a promising bay. They would ask, bargain, or sometimes fight for a slice of shoreline. Then they would build. First came a small temple, usually to a familiar god like Melkart or Baal. That was a way to claim spiritual protection and mark the site as part of the Phoenician world. Next came storehouses, simple homes, and the outline of a harbor. Over the years, that rough village might grow into a bustling town, with thick walls, crowded markets, and narrow streets filled with sailors from every corner of the sea. Inside these colonies, life was a blend. In many North African cities, you would have seen Phoenician-style houses and shrines. You would have heard prayers in a Semitic tongue and watched rites that came from the Levant. At the same time, local customs seeped into daily routine. Clothing, jewelry, and even cooking mixed foreign and native styles. In some places, indigenous gods were identified with Phoenician ones and worshipped side by side. The colony became a kind of cultural meeting point, a place where ideas, not just goods, were exchanged. Some regions absorbed this Phoenician imprint more deeply than others. In a port that lay close to the heartland and saw constant contact with the Levant, the new culture could become dominant. In other sites, especially those near strong Greek or native powers, the Phoenician element stayed mostly in the harbor and the merchant quarter. Inland villages might remain almost untouched, except for the steady flow of foreign products and coin. Geography mattered. So did timing. A colony that grew up before strong Greek rivals appeared on the scene had more room to define itself. One that was planted later had to share space or even submit to other maritime powers. No matter the local flavor, every colony fed into the same great circuit of trade. From Spain came silver, copper, and other metals. It is easy to imagine the hold of a returning ship stacked with heavy ingots and sacks of ore. From the islands and coastal plains came grain, wine, and olive oil. From North Africa came livestock, hides, and in time, war horses. From farther south and inland, funneled through this coastal line, came ivory, exotic woods, and rare resins. In return, the colonies sent out Phoenician goods and styles. Purple-dyed cloth, fine metalwork, carved ivory, glass beads, and delicate perfume bottles traveled along the same routes. The network did something else as well. It made the Mediterranean feel smaller. A sailor who had grown up in Tyre could spend his middle years in Sicily and his old age in Gadir, and still live inside a familiar world. He would find similar city layouts, similar laws, similar cults, and a similar way of doing business. Credit could move from one end of this system to the other. A debt recorded in a harbor on the Levantine coast might be paid off years later in a counting house in Spain. Trust, once built, could stretch over great distances. Yet this web of colonies was not floating in an empty sea. Other peoples were watching. The Greeks in particular were also setting up their own colonies during the 8th century BC and beyond. They too saw the value of a good harbor and a rich hinterland. Sometimes Phoenician and Greek settlers ended up side by side, each controlling a different bay or island. Sometimes they bumped into each other, nose to nose, over the same piece of coast. At Ortygia, as we saw, the Phoenicians gave way. Elsewhere, they held on. These quiet contests shaped the map of the central Mediterranean. The presence of so many distant settlements also created new kinds of risk. A colony that began as a peaceful warehouse could find itself drawn into local disputes. A tribal leader might ask for help in a war and expect the guests on his shore to choose a side. A nearby Greek city might decide that competition from a Phoenician port had become too strong and try to choke it off. Pirates might target merchant ships whose routes had become predictable. Every new opportunity came with new threats. In the early centuries, the Phoenicians handled most of these challenges with their usual tools: negotiation, gifts, trade agreements, and the careful balancing of interests. Their greatest strength was flexibility. They did not need to rule the inland lands, only the harbor and the sea lanes. They were willing to pay tribute if that kept their quays busy and their warehouses full. But as time passed, and as colonies like Carthage grew richer and more confident, calculations began to change. Walls rose higher, garrisons grew larger, warships became more common in harbors that had once held only merchantmen. The transformation from a loose mercantile web into a more militarized system did not happen overnight. It was pushed along by outside pressure. In the east, empires like Assyria watched the wealth flowing through Phoenician ports and wanted their share. In the central Mediterranean, Greek polis tested the limits of Phoenician reach. In the west, rising powers eyed the mines and markets that had made Spanish and North African colonies so valuable. Piece by piece, the network that had been built for trade was drawn into the harsh logic of power politics. Sooner or later, the merchants of Tyre, Sidon, and Carthage would have to decide how far they were willing to go to defend their roots, their colonies, and their way of life against great land empires and ambitious naval rivals alike. And to understand how this commercial network finally broke under pressure, we have to watch it collide with the great land empires that rose around it. For centuries, the Phoenician city-states survived by bending rather than breaking. When a strong neighbor appeared, they did not rush to war. They offered gifts, tribute, and the service of their ships. Their colonies could stay in business as long as the harbors remained open and the sea lanes stayed safe. But on the eastern horizon, new powers were gathering strength, and each one in turn would test how far this flexible strategy could stretch. In Mesopotamia, Assyria was hardening into a brutal imperial machine. Its kings looked west and saw rich ports along the Levantine coast. They did not see partners. They saw targets. One by one, the Phoenician cities were forced into the Assyrian system. The kings of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos agreed to pay heavy tribute. In return, they kept a measure of local freedom and were allowed to keep their ships. As long as the taxes were paid and the ports stayed loyal, the Assyrian armies marched elsewhere. On the surface, life in the harbors went on. Trade continued to move through the same old routes. But beneath that surface, the cost of staying afloat was rising. The colonies felt this strain as well. When the mother cities were squeezed, they turned to their overseas settlements for help. More silver, more grain, more tax in kind was demanded from places like Gadir or Motya. Local elites in these colonies had to balance two sets of expectations. Inland tribes expected fair treatment, reliable trade, and sometimes military aid. Officials back in the Levant or in Carthage expected steady profit and obedience. Walking that line became harder every year. Eventually, even careful compromise was not enough. After Assyria came Babylon. Under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian state extended its reach toward the sea. Tyre endured a long and exhausting siege that lasted year after year. The island half of the city was hard to crack, but the mainland districts were ravaged. When peace finally came, it did not come on ideal terms. Tyre kept its name and its walls, but had to accept a subordinate role. Much of its once proud fleet was now obliged to serve Babylonian ambitions. Farther along the coast, the same pressures pushed power out to the west. As the old Phoenician capitals in the Levant were drawn deeper into the politics of Mesopotamia, Carthage stood at a safer distance. Its ships still moved freely. Its fields remained unburned. For merchants and ship owners who wanted to escape the reach of Eastern kings, this new city looked more and more attractive. The result was a quiet shift. The beating heart of the network moved from the original Phoenician homeland to its greatest colony. Under Persian rule, the pattern changed, but did not vanish. When Cyrus the Great and his successors took over Babylon, Phoenicia became part of a new imperial map. Once again, the sea peoples knew how to survive. The Persians were pragmatists. They recognized that their vast land empire needed ships, and the Phoenicians had the best in the world. In return for tribute and naval service, the cities of the Levant kept a wide degree of internal freedom. They could run their own markets, worship their own gods, and manage their own colonies, as long as they did not rebel. Carthage, lying beyond the Persian frontier, remained technically outside this system, but was deeply tied to it through trade and shared culture. Even at this stage, the core idea of the network had not changed. Colonies were still primarily commercial tools. They existed to push the reach of Phoenician and Carthaginian merchants deeper into Spain, farther around the coast of Africa, and across the central Mediterranean. Fortifications became more common, and garrisons more visible, yet these military features were meant to protect trade, not replace it. The logic of profit still ruled, but ambition is contagious. As Carthage grew more powerful, its leaders began to think in larger terms. They did not only want safe harbors. They wanted to shape who could trade where and on what terms. In places like Sicily and Sardinia, they pushed back harder against Greek influence. In Spain, They took a stronger hand in the mines and the inland routes. Carthaginian generals led armies, not just caravans. Their admirals commanded fleets built not only to escort merchantmen, but also to fight pitched naval battles. The same sea that had once been a shared highway was turning into an arena. At the same time, new threats were rising. In the north of the central Mediterranean, Rome was slowly turning from a regional city into a larger power. At first, its reach barely brushed the Phoenician world. But as Rome expanded down the Italian peninsula and began to look outward, it ran straight into Carthaginian interests. The harbors of Sicily, in particular, became points of friction. The Phoenician model of colonization, now carried mainly by Carthage, found itself facing a very different style of power, one rooted in disciplined legions and an iron sense of destiny. The wars that followed, often called the Punic Wars, were fought long after the original Phoenician heartland had lost its independence. Yet they were, in a sense, the final act of the Phoenician colonial story. The trading web that had begun with modest way stations. In the 12th to 8th centuries, BC had grown into a Carthaginian system that stretched across the western Mediterranean. Rome did not just fight Carthage, it fought an entire tradition of sea-centered power. When Carthage finally fell, its harbor destroyed and its lands taken, the last great Phoenician-style empire at sea was gone, and still, the influence of that system lived on. The routes that the Phoenicians and Carthaginians had mapped did not disappear. Roman merchants followed the same lines to Spain, to North Africa, to islands that had once housed Phoenician colonies. Many ports simply changed hands and languages, but their basic role stayed the same. Warehouses were rebuilt, docks were repaired, ships bearing new symbols tied up where Tyrian and Carthaginian hulls had once rested. The network survived, even as its creators vanished from the stage. When we step back and look at this story, it offers a very different picture of colonization from the one many people carry in their minds today. There are no marching redcoats or overseas parliaments here. There are city-states like Tyre, Byblos, Sidon, and later Carthage, sending out waves of settlers whose first concern is not flags, but markets. There are harbors where culture blends slowly over centuries, rather than being stamped out and replaced overnight. There is control, yes, and sometimes conquest. But there is also a deep reliance on negotiation, habit, and shared profit. In many ways, the Phoenicians were an early version of something the modern world would see again. The British East India Company, many centuries later, began not as a government, but as a trading body. It planted factories and posts. It hired guards to protect merchants. It made deals with local rulers. Over time, those commercial footholds hardened into something close to empire. Trade blurred into rule. The story of Phoenicia and its colonies shows that this pattern is not new. Long before the 17th century, long before modern imperialism, a thalassocratic civilization had already walked this path. So the next time colonization comes up and thoughts go straight to the Atlantic world and recent centuries, it is worth remembering the older, salt-stained vision of empire. Picture a chain of city-states along the Levantine coast. Picture their ships fanning out across the sea, leaving behind them small clusters of houses, shrines, docks, and walls. These are the colonies of the Phoenician world. They are the bones of a system built on sails and harbors, on credit and craft, on patience and risk. For many centuries, that system shaped the Mediterranean, and even after the last Phoenician and Carthaginian flags fell, its ghost still haunted every busy quay and every crowded marketplace along the shore. In the next part of this story, we will narrow the camera even more and follow the people who actually walked these docks and crewed these ships. But first, we need to understand what it meant for an entire world to be tied together by trade. For the Phoenicians, a colony was never just a dot on a map. It was a living node in a system. Imagine the Mediterranean not as blue emptiness, but as a web of invisible lines. Each line is a route known to a pilot. Each knot is a harbor where a Phoenician or Carthaginian could drop anchor, hear his own language, and settle a debt. This web connected the Levant to Spain, Cyprus to Sardinia, Morocco to Sicily. It turned local markets into pieces of a larger machine. At the heart of that machine was trust. A merchant in Tyre might load his ship with purple cloth, worked ivory, glass, and fine metalwork. He would sail for weeks to a colony like Gadir or Carthage. There, he might not sell everything at once. Instead, he would leave goods on credit with other traders. They would sell the items slowly and send payment later, maybe in silver from a local mine, or in grain from inland fields. To make that work, everyone had to believe that the network would still be there tomorrow. The same harbors, the same rules, the same shared understanding of what a promise was worth. This is why the colonies were more than simple markets. They were also guarantors. A governor in a Phoenician settlement might be many days' sail from the homeland, but he still stood as a representative of Levantine law and custom. If a dispute broke out between a local chief and a Phoenician merchant, someone had to mediate. If a shipment vanished, someone had to investigate and compensate. Over time, written contracts, seals, and standard measures spread across the system. A weight used in one port matched a weight used in another. A seal stamped in Carthage could be recognized in Sicily or Sardinia. The sea itself pushed the Phoenicians toward this kind of order. A storm did not care about borders. It could wreck a ship from Tyre as easily as one from a Greek island. Pirates did not ask for a merchant city of origin before they attacked. To lower these risks, the Phoenicians shared information. Captains passed on warnings about dangerous straits and hostile coasts. Harbors with good defenses and reliable garrisons became preferred stopping points. Colonies competed to offer the safest anchorage, the fairest courts, and the most predictable fees. A port that gained that reputation could grow rich, not only from goods, but from the trust of the entire network. Carthage took these lessons to heart. It sat at a crossroads of routes. Ships from Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa all funneled through its bays. The city built huge artificial harbors. One basin served the merchant fleet. Another, more hidden and round, housed warships. From above, it must have looked like a pair of linked eyes staring out at the sea. The message was clear. Carthage could protect its trade. It could also project power. Its docks could launch convoys and fleets in equal measure. Yet even in Carthage, trade and colonization were tightly intertwined. When the city extended its grip over nearby coasts or islands, it did so by securing harbors and trade routes first. Walls and garrisons followed. An island might be chosen not because it was large, but because it sat in the right place along a sea lane. A strip of land might matter less for its soil than for its bay. Control of these points allowed Carthage, and before it the older Phoenician cities, to shape who could move goods and in what direction. The ripple effects ran deep inland. A Phoenician colony on the coast of North Africa might trade with tribes from far within the continent. Caravans would bring gold dust, ivory, and exotic animals to the shore. The colonists would pay in metal tools, fine cloth, wine, or glass beads. The colony itself became a hinge between worlds. It translated one set of values into another. A piece of ivory could begin its journey on a distant savanna, pass through a Phoenician workshop as a carved figure, and end up on a table in a Greek city or in a palace in Italy. The same was true in Spain. Mines under Phoenician influence produced metals that fed not only local needs, but also distant workshops back in the Levant and in other colonies. The metal might be cast into weapons, jewelry, or cult objects. In this way, a lump of ore pulled from a dark shaft far inland became a carrier of culture. It moved along the lines of the network, changing shape but always bound to the sea roads that the Phoenicians had drawn across the map. This system also changed the way people thought about distance. For a villager who had never left his home valley, the world might feel small and closed. For a Phoenician or Carthaginian sailor, the horizon was not an end. It was an invitation. The distance from Tyre to Gadir was not an empty stretch. It was a sequence of familiar stops. The same gods watched over harbors hundreds of miles apart. The same kinds of coins clinked in the same kinds of scales. Time at sea was still dangerous and uncomfortable, but it was not a blind leap into the unknown. Of course, this sense of connection had a cost. When storms destroyed fleets, the shock rippled through the entire web. A lost convoy meant empty markets at the other end of the route. A war that closed a single key strait could throw off the balance of supply and demand in many ports. If pirates grew too bold in one region, colonies there might see business fall as captains chose safer paths. The network was strong, but it was also sensitive. Every knot was tied to the others. Over the centuries, as empires rose and fell on land, this sea network stayed remarkably stable. Dynasties changed in Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. City walls crumbled and were rebuilt. Yet the same colonies in Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and Spain kept loading and unloading ships. The names of the rulers mattered less to a harbor master than the schedule of arrivals. As long as a new overlord respected trade, the network could adapt. It could serve Assyria, Babylon, Persia, or even Rome, as easily as it had once served only the Levantine cities. And that brings us back to the people who lived inside this web, from pilots and merchants to dock workers and craftspeople, whose daily choices kept the whole Phoenician and Carthaginian system alive far longer than any one king or council ever did.